right, hello to our viewers and welcome. This is a roundtable with Ethisphere and several experts at our partner EY. I am Tyler Lawrence, Executive Editor of Ethisphere Magazine, but I am not the interesting person here. That would be our three guests. And so first, could the three of you, in any order you choose, just briefly introduce yourselves and tell me a little bit about your areas of expertise and practice areas.
Okay, if you want, I can start. So hi to all. Hi, Tyler, Liban, and Katharina. My name is Cecilia Melzi. I'm a partner in the forensics practice of EY in Lima, Peru. I have more than 16 years with EY. And in Peru, we have a really strong practice, forensics practice composed by almost 90 people. But one of our main services within this forensics and integrity practice is providing the whistleblower hotline to clients. Okay, we have more than 200 clients in Peru and in the Andean region, and we help them from end to end, from since the design, since the implementation, since the training, and of course, operating the hotline continuously, right? So we have different communication channels, web, phone, email. I can give more detail during this interview, and finally reporting this information to the ethics committee. So I think it's really interesting to give my perspective in this roundtable as a provider of the service. Right. So I think that's for me.
I go
Katharina,
next one? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah. So wonderful to meet you. My name is Katharina. I'm also a partner at EY, responsible for our integrity and ethics offerings. So I had the pleasure for the last 4 years work with our clients on, first of all, how do we measure ethical culture? And in addition to that, how do we also create cultures of integrity in a more sustainable way? And the reason why I was headhunted to do this, to join the forensic practice, is because I have a research background, especially in the topic of whistleblowing, which is why I'm super excited to be here, because it's been a topic of passion over the last 10 years, ever since the financial crisis. I had the honor to have a doctoral dissertation on this and research the topic of whistleblowing for many years, and also taught in that space at Columbia University and Stern Business School. So for me, it's just a big honor to be here and also share with my fellow colleagues and with the community some of the thinking around whistleblowing, and also bringing a research lens to it. And how does that translate into practice? So any opportunity I get to speak about it, I'm there any time of the day, and really happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you.
And my name is Liban Jama. I'm a partner at EY based in Washington, D.C., and I lead our investigations and compliance practice across the Americas. I've been with EY for 4 years. And I spend a lot of my time assisting our clients in really building out their compliance programs, essentially trying to drive effectiveness, and using data to really deliver insights. And prior to being at EY, I spent a number of years in the federal government, over a decade at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I was in the Department Division of Enforcement. Around the same time, the whistleblower rules were developed by the commission. And so I give a perspective from both on the regulatory side, particularly from a US perspective, as well as the work that I do with a lot of our clients around the globe in developing their hotlines and really trying to get line of sight into insights that their employees may observe in the front lines of the work that they do. So I'm excited to be here this afternoon with all of you, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for that introduction. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of whistleblower programs and hotlines and all of that themselves, let's actually take a step back and talk about the environment, right? Because for employees to feel comfortable raising concerns, you have to set up a baseline sort of speak up culture. You have to set the expectation that employees are going to be safe and heard if they choose to raise a concern. What kind of environment is necessary for employees to have that security in the first place?
From my perspective, it's really an environment fostering of trust and building that culture out. I think, when you start to think about what you want in terms of that type of culture is to be able to enable a process, not only from a procedural perspective, but in meaningful action, where employees feel they have the security in knowing that leadership values their insights on issues that they may think are problematic. And it really comes down sort of the maxim of see something, say something that we're all familiar with as we travel around the globe in a post 9/11 environment. And I think really developing and building out systems that demonstrate that value that, so that folks know that leadership is not just simply talking about it, but is going and actually talking down the organization to folks who are doing the work to really express their interest in that feedback, and then taking that feedback and looping it around and showing that and demonstrating that that feedback was actually followed through on. And I think that's critically important, particularly in an environment with remote working, particularly an environment where folks feel disconnected and may not be willing to share as much because they're not next to the person they normally would talk to or chat with. Interested in others' views.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Cecilia. Sorry.
No, you first, Katharina, please.
Okay, thank you. No, I think this is exactly right. The whole topic around culture, I think we need to be really mindful about how do we design and perpetuate, you called it culture of trust, Liban, which I love, but then also how do we value the very concept of employee voice, or how do we value the very concept of dissent? And so if we really ask ourselves the question, what type of organization do I want to design? Then I think this is an inherent part of how do we create a culture where voice is really a really important element of progress, a really important element of innovation, a very important element of driving us forward and having a sustainable business. And so for me, it's almost like a reframing of what this concept is and how do we embed it into a culture in order to have a successful business, because it really is a driver for sustainable success. And then if we look into the research, if I may just add this, we probably also have to ask ourselves why people don't speak up. And the reason why they don't speak up is either they know nothing is going to happen. So this whole concept of organizational justice, I have seen it before and people haven't been heard, but also then the fear of retaliation, as well as they maybe know nothing is going to get done. Nobody is going to listen to me anyway, so I'm not going to speak up. And so I think that's something where organizations need to be really mindful of how do we mitigate this, and also how do we design an organization very mindfully around creating that psychological safety, but then also how in moments where people don't speak up, create an environment through leadership, through role modeling, and through also how we conduct ourselves on a daily basis in a way in which we model voice and hear voice and listen to voice and dissent. So I think it's the little moments and habits that we perpetuate in a culture that ultimately also, when things are getting trickier and there are really difficult situations we need to deal with, that's the moment when we need to listen, when we need to include voices, and where we really need to try to leverage the power of the diverse mindsets and diverse cognitive powers that we bring to the table from different people, if that makes sense. And over to you, Cecilia.
Yeah, and just to complement, totally agree with Liban and Katharina, and taking into account what Katharina just said, for a person to make a report, it's not an easy decision. So it's not that, I'm just today, I wake up and say, I want to make a report. No, it's like a balance of cost and benefit. So we as companies should give them this situation that the balance goes to the side that is a benefit. It's a win-win, right? And trust is totally the key thing, that the tool works. Trust that the company will take consideration and will listen, and if applicable, will take the correspondent corrective actions, right? And I think a really important comment is the people should know that the company really believes in that this is not a company wants to comply with any regulation or because they want to be in the good picture and say, I have a whistleblower or I listened from people. No, it's because they really believe in that, right? So it's a value. So that's a really big difference in the message you give to people why you do things. It's not because I want to comply or avoid any penalty. It's because I really believe in that. So that type of messages from the top management and promoting a speak up culture, I think are totally key for this. Just to complement.
Just to piggyback on what you said, Cecilia, going to that element of trust, we at EY did a comprehensive global integrity report for 2020 that really talked about this issue of trust. We surveyed 3,000 companies. And what I found fascinating, and I've talked to clients about this, is, within that, 1 in 5 folks, 1 in 5 respondents felt that they weren't sufficiently protected. They were concerned about retaliation. And I think that's something that's pretty compelling. And that goes to an element of trust from a integrity perspective and cultural perspective, which is being able to build that environment. Habits, in my mind, create culture. And how you develop those habits and support those habits, build the culture you want to have. And so it's interesting, even within our most recent survey, there's still components in that where people still feel that lack of trust within their organization. Despite having most organizations in the same report, we had 94% of organizations said they had a hotline, they had some component of their code of conduct referencing the ability for folks to be able to have a conversation. But still there's that disconnect, which I find pretty interesting and fascinating even today.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds like, there's a whole range of elements that go into creating a culture where employees are going to feel empowered and safe to speak up, right? You have to have this trust in basic organizational justice, which Katharina mentioned. You have to have this sense that, the senior management actually listens to and cares about the concerns of frontline employees, right? I know that other experts at EY have referred to this as a listen down culture, right? We talk about a speak up culture all the time, but it does no good to empower employees to speak up if nobody above them is actually going to, care what it is they have to say. And of course, all that's very complicated, and it's sort of table stakes for even thinking about having an effective whistleblower program. And we could spend all day talking about the cultural components there. But let's go a little bit. What risks does a company create by not promoting this kind of culture where, creating a situation where employees might be hesitant to report, ignoring signs that employees are in fact maybe not reporting concerns that they say, right? This is definitely not a no news is good news situation.
Yeah, go ahead, Cecilia. You're about to speak.
No, yes, I think that the main risk related to this is the lack of trust. So the lack of commitment from the employees in what the company is doing, and they will look for channels to report. So if they don't go to the company, which is of course the best option, they maybe will go to regulators or to others. So I think the company, that's the main risk, because the company what needs to have is information, listen to that and take it. And not only about the extinguish the fire for that situation, it's also knowing the root cause of what happened, because I can just extinguish the fire, but why this happened and how can I do to avoid this happen again? But the main risk is that the people do not believe in what the company is doing, do not think they have available channels within the company, and go to regulators. That's first. And second for me is that, of course, if you don't have that, you will not be able to detect maybe timely some situations about fraud or about irregular actions that could help you lose less, because you are going to detect in a timely manner. Right.
I completely agree. And I want to be a bit provocative here. And I think that is exactly right. But I also think about it from the commercial perspective. So often when we talk about what are the downsides, we talk about it from the lens of blind spots, missing something, reputational harm. And I think if we take a step back, all of those elements are really important, but we're in an environment where expectations have changed and shifted. And what I mean by that is when people start talking about, in particular, the topic of ESG, there's the element of S and G. And more employees, particularly younger employees, expect their organizations to have the type of environment that allows them to be aligned with the missions and values that are actually put on the webpage and are put in the code of conduct. There's an expectation. And so what's going to happen is what's happening now, we can see it across the board and we're seeing with lots of different clients, is there is a commercial imperative in terms of talent retention and being able to be competitive in the marketplace. So folks are much more portable, they're skilled, and if they have an opportunity to decide to go somewhere else where they feel that the environment is more conducive for them to be able to deliver on their skill sets and are in alignment with the missions and values that they seek, it's a retention point, it's a commercial point. So not only is it the sort of the negative consequences that have always been there historically of something bad happening, not knowing about it, then having regulatory issues and all of that, there is also that added element, and I'm seeing it more and more of how do we retain our people? And there's an alignment there. And so if we want to be competitive in the marketplace, we want top talent, we want to be able to foster an environment that allows that top talent to grow and meet our commercial goals, to really meet our mission. And that inevitably helps us grow our business, satisfy investors, satisfy our customers, and meet our stakeholder goals. So I just wanted to add that element that I think is critically important. And I think we're in an inflection point and it's accelerating much more so in this post-COVID or in this COVID environment.
Yeah, and if I may build on this, Liban, I think you're making an excellent point around the commercial aspects of it, because over the last couple of years, I think there's also been a clear indication that in the long run, a healthy culture would also pay off. So not only in attracting talent or engagement of employees and productivity, but also in loyalty of customers, as well as how you're attracting investors and capital. So I think that's also something that's adding to the equation that you were just opening up. And I think that's a really compelling story that the business world, of course, loves to hear. Apart from the fact that I think it's just the right thing to do. I mean, there's a clear intersection between business and society. And so the element of listening to employees when they speak up is one element of your responsibility of aligning with what's expected of you, just like you rightly said, Liban. So I think that's really very important topic.
Mm-hmm. What are some warning signs that companies should be looking for that perhaps they have a problem in this department, right? We talked about the notion of employee retention, right? And if you have, certain parts of your business where the retention rate is significantly worse than others, or just like a consistently high retention problem in certain roles, that may be one kind of sign. But what other, whether it's metrics, whether it's softer indications, should folks be looking for?
From my perspective, the lack of information in the system. So sometimes it's counterintuitive. Folks will say, our hotline numbers are down. That might be problematic, right? Are people feeling safe and secure to talk? So it's not sort of the zero-sum game of what you measure is, the classic, axiom of measuring and focusing on that data element for improvement. It's also the counterintuitive acknowledgement and realization that maybe you're not hearing everything, maybe everything's not coming to you. And that is in and of itself a signal. So oftentimes when we look at the data post-COVID, if we look at data we've seen, particularly in the US, particularly with a lot of the social justice issues that have arisen in the common space, you could see a spike in a lot of hotline activity with respect to workplace misconduct. And then it completely slowed down for a lot of sectors afterwards. Does that indicate there were less issues? I don't think so. I think that sometimes that we have to look at the data holistically and not simply look at it from that lens. And so that's one of those things where I think that it causes some blind spots. But curious about what others think, Cecilia, Katharina.
Yeah, I was going to also say this holistic approach of measurement is really important. because if you look at speak up data, it's only one element of looking into culture overall. And so I think there are a lot of more proxies that you can look at that seem to influence also speak up behavior. And retention is something we talked about earlier as one element, but others that I could think of is also maybe looking at external data. What is some of the perception in the market overall on your brand, on your organization, not just as an employer, but also if you look into ratings, what is your company being perceived as? But then also, if you look internally, there are a lot of other structured data approaches where you can look into HR data, but also how diversity and inclusion seems to influence the way in which people feel like they can bring their whole self, they feel like they can belong, and they feel like they can speak up about certain topics that seem to bother them, especially in times of COVID. And so I think we need to, just like we said earlier, look at it in a more integrative and holistic way to be more meaningful in the way we measure, as opposed to making it a benchmark that we need to follow and speak up data is A, B, or C. It doesn't mean anything if we don't take into consideration the overall context to make really this whole approach more meaningful, and also as a consequence design our measures around it that really help to turn the needle in building a culture of integrity in the long run.
Yeah, and just more about internal science. The decrease in the number of concerns or reports is totally critical. I can talk you about an example that we have in Peru in this service we give. We helped launching a mining company, really like the hotline. And the first 2 days that we launched the hotline, we received 40 reports, 40 in 2 days. So we just say, wow, so these people needs to talk, wow. So we were like full of making the reports and transmitting this to the ethics committee, which was the general manager, right, at that point. But then the management do not feel so good with all the information they received. So they just, not close, but they just do not put any interest in the hotline. So at the end, these 2 days were 40, then 2, 5, 6, and then no more. So the people realize that this is not going to work because the management has not taken any action. So the people know what is happening, right? Mm-hmm. So they really know that there were no interest, and at the year that the contract was finalized, do not renew the line, and we never heard from them again, right? So it's really interesting how the people know and feel, and they will not take this decision that is an important decision to talk if they know this will not take any effect, right? And also the lack of knowledge of the ethics hotline, so this is not like just I launch once in a year and I forgot. There should be like defining a periodic updates about how important this is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that gets into the next question that I have, which is, trust in the process is extremely key to having an effective whistleblower program, right? It can't just exist. Employees have to actually think something might come of it. And so, what are best practices that companies ought to be looking at? Okay, they think that they have the right sort of cultural setup where employees feel like they ought to be able to speak up in theory. They have a official hotline program or other avenues for whistleblowers to report to. What else should companies do to make sure that employees have trust in the process and trust that investigations will be handled fairly in a timely manner? They have some trust in the organizational justice aspects, again, that, people are going to be treated fairly, all of that sort of thing.
If you allow, I can go first here. Sorry, Liban. I have like 3 key best practices I want to share. The first one is for me the critical, and is that to have a third party in charge of operating the whistleblower hotline. Why? Because that third party will be independent, will be objective without any conflict, and will give the employees the how can I say, I forgot the word in English, like the credibility that they will not be retaliation. So in our statistics that we have for all the services we provide, 82% of the people that report makes anonymous, right? They make anonymous and they do not want to share their information company, but 33% do want the information with us. So they give us to EY and say, this is my you, not for the company. I'm not asking you, EY, to share this information with the client, with the company, just to you. So we can make follow-ups, we can ask more questions, and then we report to the ethics committee. But I don't want their information to be shared because they are scared. They are concerned about retaliation, right? So if you handle the line internally, that will not happen. You will lose probably. I'm not saying that a company cannot have it internally, but I'm saying that for me, the best practice is to have a third party. And also my second advice is to have a compliant lines procedure. So you have to know what to do. You have to know which is the ethics committee that will receive that information. And also you have to have alternative ways, because what happens if one report involves one of the ethics committee members? So you have to have a backup or an alternative way to report. But all this should be known by the people. Because if you don't say that to people, you have a third party, you don't say that the ethics committee is ABC, you don't say that if ABC are involved, you will go to D, right? The people will say, I don't want to report, because that will not have any effect, right? And also you have to have homogeneous and timely response. Because you cannot react differently if there's a manager or if there's like an assistant. It has to be homogeneous. And also in a timely way. You cannot have like 1 year investigating something. Of course, there are cases and cases, but in average, I don't know, maybe 30 or 60 days are like an average time to report this. And my third advice is this has to be disclosed, as I said. Which is the third party, which is the procedure, which are my way to investigate, right? Independently, objective. So I think for me, these are the three key aspects about best practices. Sorry for the long speech.
No, you're the expert here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that, I agree completely with what Cecilia is saying. And then I think part of it is also just sort of fundamentals of how you want to communicate, right? And I think that there's a powerful component of communication that is the ability to tell narratives and to be able to share that transparently. And I think that, I think where organizations really are successful are the ability to be able to champion and highlight instances and communicating it appropriately to the employee base so that folks can appreciate and understand. Let's really take a step back here. All of us on this panel, as well as folks listening, can picture our days full of emails and communications and notifications and things that fill our days. And within the course of the day, what are the things that are most memorable to us? Some folks are visual learners, some folks are audio learners. I think a big component, and I know, Katharina, we've talked about this before in terms of behavioral psychology and understanding the ways that people retain information. I think organizations that really give a thoughtful process to saying, how are we going to communicate it as thoughtful as we would be communicating to folks about our results on a quarterly basis? What are the themes we want to suggest? What do we want to highlight? And then also, because of that, who's listening? So I've had situations where folks talk about the fact that I, as the CEO of this company, have monthly town halls, and we communicate our values during these town halls consistently 12 times a year. But then when you ask the question, well, how many people on the ground at that BU who are on the front lines doing the work are listening? Do you have that data? You have segmented out in terms of the risks that people are facing and that you have concerns about. That's important. And then the other component is, I think, and we'd be remiss not to talk about this, is cultural considerations. And I think in the US, we have our own biases in place of how we think things should be done. And it's incredibly important to have the type of nuanced conversations around the globe on what is expected, what is likely to occur, to listen to what folks have to say that would be most effective in a particular geographic space, even in the US as well. And understanding that and being open-minded and holistic. I think we've used that phrase before in our approach and our mindset. And I think when you do that, you're doing your level best. So I just wanted to emphasize the power of narratives, actually trying to figure out who's listening, and then in terms of your audience, and then most importantly, being culturally attuned and not blinded by that. So those are the themes I wanted to just raise there on that.
Yeah, I would love to emphasize everything my colleagues said, and then add one additional lens, which is only just pushing forward the same topics, which is I really feel like we need to put people over process. And what I mean by that is, and my colleagues have alluded to this already, what I mean by that is really from the beginning of the experience with how they engage in formal channels, through the way in which they are being guided through the process and being updated throughout the process, and how they're being guided afterwards and informed afterwards. And so people over process, what it means to me is really to be human-centric and try to understand what seems to be driving them, what seems to be making them afraid, what seems to be not working so well, and really trying to understand how can we facilitate and normalize the process for people ultimately, because any type of ambiguity is going to add extra anxiety, is going to add extra burden to the person that's speaking up. And so I think also what we can see in the regulatory space, especially here in Europe now with the new whistleblower protection that's becoming effective at the end of this year, is that speed seems to be something really important. And how do we progress through the process with each of the person that's speaking up? So I think altogether 3 months that you have to give an update on the case. So I think speed to get this component of ambiguity out and to really stay in touch with the person that speaks up is really important. And one last point about this that I think is also very much linked to what Liban said, the root cause of some of the cases that we see come out of the programs have to be fed back into the organization, and we need to find ways to find a way to, in an abstract way, to communicate it back to the organization. Why do these topics happen? What are the patterns? Why do these patterns occur? What are the measures we are taking to remediate this in the long run? And I think that's where some of the organizations are lacking, and where all of us can really progress in the way in which we make those programs more effective, including ourselves, because it's, I think, really important. And that's where we are at the intersection of, we don't want to share anything to report out because of confidentiality and privilege, etc. But on the other hand, there is an element, if we package it in the right way, it can be really powerful as an organizational learning skill to bring this back into the organization and really try to move ahead and try to make people feel like, hey, we have heard you. We maybe weren't able to do something about it, but here are the reasons why. And I think that that's also something I would love to push forward in a greater scheme of things. Mm-hmm.
Well, and all of us, all three of you, I think, have mentioned or touched on it, but I do want to hit directly on, what is perhaps the single biggest barrier to most whistleblowers, which is the fear of retaliation, right? The fear that they will not be protected, or they won't be adequately protected, or that the organization has an anti-retaliation policy, but do they trust it? Do they trust their own manager or whoever is involved in the report? What can organizations do to really make good on retaliation protections? What kind of follow-up do leading organizations do, both of the, with the reporter and with anybody else perhaps who is involved in an investigation, and how long should that monitoring go on?
From my perspective, it's critically important to highlight those cases and letting people know that we had someone raise an issue and we're being transparent about it. And these are the things we did to reform and remediate, and celebrate that and say, this is part of what we want to see. And if you do that consistently, you build a culture of expectation on that. And I think the more you're able to do that, the better. And I think that allays the concerns of retaliation significantly. And I think that, still today, I mean, we have a lot of folks in our last report, 53% felt on average uncomfortable reporting because of that component. And it was a wide spectrum, right? So as high as 83% in Japan, 38% in Mexico, just depending on the jurisdictional location. But I think being able to provide that compelling narrative and being able to highlight those cases and showing it's been really addressed is critically important to allaying those concerns.
What I am seeing and what we're ending here for companies is to have this non-retaliation policy, or if not a policy, to have like a text part in the code of conduct or in any policy about the hotline that establishes clearly that the top management is committed to a non-retaliation. But I think the key question here is, what is retaliation for the company? So this has to be established, which conducts or which considerations are retaliation, right? So that has to be like established, and the top management committed to that, and establish also the protection measures for employees who feel that way. And what we are seeing here with some clients also is that they establish like a monitoring for some for 1 month, some for 3 months, and they try to reach the reporters because sometimes they, as I said, they give us information about emails, phone numbers, obviously when they want, it's not mandatory, of course, and ask us to make a follow-up, like, do you have any more information, or how are you feeling, or have you feel something about retaliation? So it's kind of the due diligence that the company makes to be sure that the reporters are not feeling that way. But I think the key aspect here is to have formalized like a non-retaliation policy, or at least a section in the code of conduct or in the complaints line procedure, establish that, right?
Yeah,
and in the
policy,
to it.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, Katharina.
Go ahead, Liban.
No. Go, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the policy, it's exactly right. I think it's there's also a way in which you can maybe sanction behavior of retaliation. So really go one step further, where organizational justice can also, can come in quite handy when we say, and we don't just have a retaliation policy, but we also would sanction behavior for those who would retaliate against those report in good faith. That's one aspect, but I think also another really inspiring example that I've seen recently is also to look into the trajectory of those who are reporting and their careers and how they're evolving after time. Because from the research, what we can also see is that the career can very much be inhibited from people who speak up, because people found out who spoke up, or anonymity couldn't be ensured. And so what I thought was really inspiring about this is to be really careful about how do we look at the careers of each single person that's reporting and those who raise concerns, and try to understand if it really has an impact on their career, and if there's any way we can prove that those people maybe left the organization after a year, and try to track this to become really more serious about, do we really mean what we put in our formal policy? And do we have a way to look into data as well, to what extent we fulfill our promise of no retaliation? Because maybe the data shows something very different when we follow their career path. And so that's maybe one example that I thought was quite fascinating.
And if you allow me, maybe I will change subject, sorry, here, but we're talking a lot about retaliation, about the whistleblower, right? But don't forget about the accused person. Right. So the people involved in the reports. Because of course, we are training people to say, hey, this is serious, this is not like a gossip channel, and you have to have evidence. But here I think it's key how the company structures their investigations. So how do they establish confidentiality? Because you cannot damage any reputation about anyone, right? Just for a report. So the company has to have a structured processes of investigations internally or with a third party, but with confidentiality, joining, if it's necessary, the legal counsel or the human resources expert, etc., depending on the case. But I think it's very important also to protect the accused person of any reputation damage based on these reports.
And that emphasizes the independence of the process, Cecilia, the point they were making before, having a third party be involved in that process to be able to ensure the integrity, the objectivity, and the independence of that is critically important. And so I think that is an excellent point you both just made.
Well, actually, can we go a little bit deeper into this question of exactly how do you structure the situation, right? Because whistleblowing requires this delicate balance of anonymity and protecting the anonymity of reporters, but ideally you want to have them trust you enough to be able to follow up with them, to be able to ask more questions, to be able to track their career trajectory, right? All of which you can't do with a completely anonymous report. So, how can companies attempt to strike that balance? And, are there tools or structures that have come into place that are allowing companies now to maintain that line of communication, even with a completely anonymous report, for example?
Yeah, may I go first, Liban?
Yeah.
So maybe I'll start off by saying, first of all, I think the most mature organizations that I have seen have a way in which they already monitor which reports come in informally, through ways of just going to the supervisor or going to a peer or the manager or the union. And they have a way to put this back into their system to then also have a ratio of how many people report through formal channels, how many people report through informal channel. My hypothesis would be that organizations who have more informal speak up cases have also a higher level of trust and also a higher culture of integrity, as we have described also in the beginning, that this could be a really good proxy for us to measure if we're progressing in that space. So that's one aspect, that today already you can monitor your informal and formal speak up behavior. Then the other part that I see, which I think is really fascinating and super exciting also, is how technology enables us to be so much more advanced in the way in which we serve employees to have a good experience, and almost like a customer experience, I don't know, watching Netflix or going on Amazon, and how technology enables us to really have this element of ambiguity taken out of the process. And like I said earlier, with this people over process, technology really enables us to have a confidential conversations throughout the process and guiding people through the process and making them feel comfortable. And I think this is really one of the most promising developments that we can see in the market, whether that's EY internally or external suppliers as well, where I personally have a lot of hope that this is going to really change the game in which we are engaging with those who speak up and might not feel comfortable yet to speak up also in an informal way. Until we are there, I think technology is going to close that gap heavily, and I think that's really an exciting development that we can see.
Couldn't agree more, and I think that as folks learn more about those processes, particularly on the technology side, you're able to develop and build more confidence. And what I mean by that is, with the analytics and being able to take all the intake, it's not just the individual hotline requests, it's in a collective, and being able to see the patterns and being able to educate people that because we're taking it seriously, we're consolidating, we're running analytics, we're learning, and then we are essentially doing a heat mapping exercise, and then we're tailoring our remediation based on those analytics so that we can have a much more fulsome end-to-end process in how we address these issues. It's not simply we listen to or read the intake and then open up an investigation and then we're done. It's no, we are taking lessons learned and we're figuring it out. And I think that's what's really exciting, as Katharina mentioned, is the merging of being able to take the intake of that information, that structured information, marrying it with unstructured data that is also part of the overall compliance structure. So this is not also in isolation. So educating people about the fact that this is just one component within a code of conduct that we think is incredibly important, but we are trying to have a systemic, holistic, integrated approach to our compliance program because we think it's important. And you individual and employee, are so critical to us being successful in that space. And so when you do raise this concern, we're going to spend a little time educating you about what we're doing with it and how we're marrying that up. And I think the more and more folks do that, the better. Then technology is getting to the point where you can start running some predictive analytics and then being able to say, you know what, we need to do some more training or we need to make some adjustments here.
And a way, just to complement, and a way to balance this anonymity with follow-up is to give all the reporters, all the people that reports, a code. So they receive a code through email, through web page, through phone, through whatever channel, they receive a code. So they can then access to the web page portal, for example, or you know, an online platform, and they can put their code, and the company should give them information. But which type of information? Of course, that's not a specific guideline, but for example, you can say investigation in process, you can say investigation dismissed because there's no further information, or seeking for more information, or investigation in process or closed. So that information allows the person that reports to feel, okay, I made something, but this is having an effect. So they are doing something about that, right? So that really gives solidity and trust in the system. And of course, making this, what Liban says and what Katharina says, making these data analytics processes to have patterns and to have trends, which departments are the most affected, which locations are the most, right, having the most quantity of situations. So trying to identify also these patterns to make decisions that reviewing controls or processes that could allow these departments or locations being better, right? But I think that the company should establish a way of keeping in touch with the reporters.
It's an excellent point, because also employees in their personal lives, and I think we made this point earlier, have those expectations. I mean, think about it. If they're unhappy with something, a product or service, they're able to log on and figure out what happened, register it, and see the life cycle. So they're going to have that same level of expectation within their work environment and how reporting works and transparency for them.
And that's key, because we receive a lot of emails saying, what happened with my report? When they enter and they do not find anything, what happened with my report? I said this 2 months ago and I don't know nothing. So we are always encouraging companies to make these specific lines, but that the persons can enter and see the status.
It's interesting to think of it almost as a customer service problem or a user experience problem, right? Where, you know, we're used to being able to click a code and track a package being shipped to us, and I know when it's on the truck and where, you know, what city it's in and when it's finally been delivered at my door. And there's no reason that we can't provide reporters with the same level of, you know, general update on how things are doing. And, you know, if that's the expectation that we've created, then it's bad. I have nothing to add. That's just an interesting way to think about it.
This is amazing. It's really well said. I think, Tyler, you're spot on. And at the end of the day, our employees are our customers, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we need to create experiences and make them feel included and that we care. So I think perfectly verbalized what we're trying to accomplish, and technology is definitely the key enabler. And as Liban said, linked with data analytics, that's an amazing development that we couldn't do 10 years ago. And so that's why I personally feel this is really shifting the way in which we approach this topic, and it's long overdue. And I think it's really the way to go as well.
And it's what we're working on collectively every single day, is connecting those dots. And for a number of our clients who are on that maturity curve, that's what they're doing. They're taking that orientation of looking at their employee base, 50,000, 100,000, and saying, how are we going to make that user experience with respect to these areas for us to measure effectiveness as easy as possible? And that's where things are moving towards.
Yeah, and just another idea, maybe if the companies do not want to have this code and have this information, like specific, they could use, I don't know, their bulletins, their quarterly or monthly magazines, or, I don't know, town hall meetings, and just say, hey, the line will receive like 20 reports. They don't have to give a lot of detail, but just say, we received 20 reports related to these topics, and we have taken the corresponding actions. Maybe that's it, but the people know that this is work. I think that's the key.
Even in aggregate. Well, and that gets to my final question, which is that I think at organizations who are not necessarily on the leading edge of these trends, the instinct is very much not towards transparency, right? It's this notion that, well, investigations are something we keep as quiet as possible. We don't really want to talk too much about it. We don't necessarily want to, you might give people the wrong idea that we have a problem, or that this is, we have major issues if we're talking about it too much. How do you, if you are the chief compliance officer or head of investigations or something like that in an organization with these conservative instincts, how do you convince people and get buy-in that no, really, we're not going to be incurring liability. We're not going to be inspiring more problems by being more transparent about this. We'll actually be helping ourselves.
From my perspective, it's always, go ahead, Katrina, you were about to say.
Please go ahead, Liban. Really.
It's my perspective is aligning with commercial interest, really understanding the business issues that your stakeholders are managing through and speaking in that language, in that lens. I think a lot of times from a compliance perspective, we're always talking about things from a reactionary perspective. Something happened, we're reacting, right? As opposed to when you're looking at things and saying, how, if I was in a business commercial context here, what can I do from a compliance perspective or an investigatory perspective to really take learnings, help enable business decisions on a quick and much more efficient basis based on past precedent? What are the things I could be bringing to the table and orienting it that way? And to give like a grounded specific experience would be, if I'm onboarding and I've got issues in a third-party risk management and it's taking too long, what are the things I can use in terms of analytics to help shorten that process? If I'm looking at a hotline data and I want to talk about that, how can I take those insights and really effectuate change on a production basis or whatever it might be within a particular BU that would help save costs and drive efficiencies? So I think that marrying the two, it should not be mutually exclusive. And having that discussion and that orientation and that framework makes people listen. And I think you have to speak the language within your organization and tailor it with your organization to be able to effectuate the change you want to drive towards and figuring out those levers. But that's my perspective. Katrina, I know you were about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to this commercial case also, and also the way that I would probably lead these conversations is to share a bit of a macro perspective of what are some of the trends that we see in the world, and the sum of those macro trends all seem to indicate that transparency and the push for these topics is not going away. I mean, there is no turning back, and the problem will be that those organizations probably will be distinct or less successful than those who have already jumped on the wagon much more ahead of the curve. And those macro trends, I mean, we touched upon them already earlier. One of them is investors who are pushing heavily for ESGs. How do we measure? How are we more transparent? You can see institutional investors looking into how can we transparently look into metrics and share our portfolios and how they're performing in regards to some of the compliance effectiveness measures, as well as whistleblower data. And all of this is already readily available in real-time dashboards online, so that institutional investors are becoming more transparent in the way in which they allocate their capital. And I think that's a trend we can also see in the regulatory space. I mean, Liban, with your experience, you have already been part of that game, if I may say, and we can see them pushing also heavily into how do you monitor, how do you report externally, how do you link this back to ESG, and then the same is true for the business overall. How do you attract talent? We talked about this as well earlier, and then finally, our social norms have evolved heavily. So what's accepted as a way to conduct yourself and to also report and be transparent about certain topics has shifted in our society overall. So what the public interest is expecting from organizations is also dramatically shifting the way in which organizations have to adapt to this. And so the way I would engage in this conversation is which one of those macro trends and which one of those influencers seems to be relevant for you, and would it make sense to engage in the conversation a bit deeper to see which one of those paths should be followed and why, and I think then you really have a good case to continue that road.
And just to totally align with Liban and Katharina, is more about the same. Is we have to sell. If I'm the compliance officer, I have to sell to the board or to the general manager that this is a matter of numbers. So you are going to earn more and you're going to lose less. So you are going to have more revenues because knowing this, you are going to be able to improve processes, to know about where are the weaknesses, establish new controls, and that will make the organization more efficient, and that will generate more revenue. And you will lose less because you will know in a more timely manner what is happening, and you're going to be able to prevent and not more situations like that. So I think it's like the board and the general managers always love numbers, so the compliance officer should go with numbers and say you're going to have more revenues and less costs. So that's something you need to do. I think that's the key here also.
Wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if I managed to get through the entire thing without leaving myself on mute. All right, well, thank you all so much for your time. I think that's a great note for us to end it on. Everyone, once again, these have been three lovely experts from EY on this vitally important topic of whistleblowing. So thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tyler, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.